So this is maybe fast forwarding a little bit, starting to think about jobs and where you might want to work once you graduate. And actually, I think it does apply now too to thinking about internships and even choosing where you might want to do an internship in the summer. So we all know that things you might consider when you're looking at a job are things like salary and benefits and all of those kind of quantitative things. But we're also thinking about, well, what are the qualitative things that we should be incorporating into a job search? How do you know that a company is going to be the right fit for you? And I think especially as the majority of people in this room are women in tech, and we know that a lot of tech companies don't employ a lot of women, there are some special considerations, I would think, in terms of thinking about where you're really going to feel comfortable and where you're going to feel at home and what types of questions you should be asking yourself and asking the companies that you're looking at to determine whether it's a good fit or not. So I'm happy to introduce our panelists. So we have Alexandra Kavulakis, founder and chief operating officer of The Muse. And The Muse is a career platform used by 50 million millennials, that's an amazing number, to find a job, learn professional skills, or advance their careers. And so if you guys are starting to think about looking at companies, The Muse is a great place to do that. And then we have Whitney Hess, who is a coach and writer and also a UX expert. And Whitney is now focused on helping people bring their whole selves to work. And it's her life's mission to put humanity back into business. So she has a lot of insights about really exploring, thinking about who you are as a person and developing self-awareness and thinking about working as a team and where you would fit in terms of finding just the right role for yourself. So we're going to start with, I actually want to start with you, Whitney, and just a little bit about what I just said. So, I really think of self-awareness as one of the essential skills for the future of work. And that ties into, if you don't know anything about yourself and don't understand yourself, then how are you going to find a good job for you? So you work with a lot of coaching clients, and maybe you can just tell us a little bit about how you might approach that question and that task with a coaching client who is trying to figure out themselves and figure out where they would fit.
Okay, so thank you. I'll share a little bit about what I experienced. Before I became a coach, I was working as a user experience designer for a software company, and I was so focused on being good at my job that I was ignoring a lot of other things. So, for instance, if I really had a tough problem that I was in the middle of solving, but I had to go to the bathroom, I'd hold it until I was ready to, close the app or whatever I was working on and walk away from it. And what I eventually came to learn was that I wasn't really paying enough attention to myself. I was paying more attention to the work than I was to me. And over time, as I became a coach, I began to realize that I had had a lot of career experiences that were less than ideal because of that lack of attention that I was paying to myself. So what I now coach my clients to do is to take a small moment in the middle of the day to connect with themselves. And it's a simple thing to do. You can just stop what you're doing, close your eyes if you're in a place where you feel comfortable to do that, take a deep breath, and just check in and ask yourself, how am I doing today? Like, am I feeling tense? Am I feeling anxious? Do I feel like I have enough space to get my work done in a way that I'm comfortable doing it? Or am I feeling like I don't have what I need to be most effective? And if I don't, what am I missing and where can I go get it? Just that little moment of checking in has made such a difference in the choices that I make in my career, and I'm finding that it's making a lot of difference with the clients that I coach as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you and I have talked about before too is that moment also is a good time to check in with whatever voices are happening in your head. Whether it's that imposter syndrome voice of telling you that you're not good enough and that you're stepping out of your comfort zone and doing something. Whether it's that should voice telling you, well, you should be doing this and you should be doing that. And I think there are a lot of shoulds out there, especially around career, sometimes trying to impress your parents or make your parents happy with your career choice, feeling like you need to live up to a certain expectation, that type of thing. And sometimes that can get in the way of making a choice that's really good for you.
Yes, I call that shooting all over myself.
I thought that's where I had heard that line before. And Alex, what about you? I mean, in terms of just even thinking about your personal journey and the things that we were just discussing about connecting with yourself and understanding yourself and how you've ended up where you are.
Yeah, so started the Muse almost 6 years ago now, which is crazy. And I think there's a couple things that I've learned through the journey, both switching from I was a management consultant. I worked with big clients on hard problems with smart people, and I realized I really liked that piece of it, and that was something I wanted to continue having. But there were a lot of things I also wanted to learn and do differently. But through building a site that helps people with their careers, what we do is help people figure out what you want to do with your life, how to get there, look inside of companies. I think one of the things that's most important is before kicking off the job search, before putting in that resume, taking a moment to really think about what you want. The point about the parents is a great one. A lot of people ended up in management consulting because it's a really stable, prestigious job. The percentage of people, of my close friends who were there, who worked with me, who were firstborn and first generation, was way more than the normal population. And we actually had conversations about it. We're like, this is how we prove that it was worth our parents' sacrifice. This is how we showed them that we did the best we could. And it's both laudable to do that, but also realizing, how am I making those choices and who am I making them for? I think right now, a lot of students and new grads are seeing this as well in terms of thinking about, I should go into startups. My friends think startups are cool. I think startups are cool. Startups are not for everyone. It is not always easy to work for one. It's a lot of ups and downs. There's a lot less structure. There's less training. For some people, that's really exciting, but you have to listen and know yourself. So what we talk to people a lot about is figuring out what are your values right now for you? What are you trying to optimize for? And you could take two people in this room who both have the same degree, took the same classes, have the same interests, but one of them is optimizing for stability, compensation, and growth. And one could be, looking for flexibility, creativity, and a chance to travel, right? And you'll pick different jobs, you'll pick different companies, and that's okay. So I think taking a moment up front to say, okay, what do I want? Lets you evaluate industries, companies, and jobs, and make sure you're not sort of getting driven by the current, but instead of finding your own way.
And I think what can be interesting too is that for some people, that's a one-time decision in their life. Like they find something that somehow grows with them, and they really only had to decide once and make that alignment once with their values and what was important to them at the time. But I would say for the majority of people, I think it requires making that decision over and over again because, in your early 20s, maybe lots of travel, lots of creativity, something that is more like a startup and is maybe not as stable is fine. But maybe as you get a little bit older, you're trying to pay for kids' daycare, you're paying for a mortgage, whatever it is, that you need more stability, you care more about what the health insurance looks like, all of those types of things.
Yeah, we talk a lot about how it's really, you should think about the next 2 to 5 years. Like some people know what they want their dream job to be, and that's awesome if you are one of those people. If you don't know the answer to that question, that's okay. You don't need to know what you're going to do in 20 years. Think about the next 2 to 5, and that's plenty. Because you'll learn a lot through that process, and then you go through the questioning all over again. You think about the next role, the next path. And also the world is changing really quickly. There will be roles available. There will be new industries and companies that don't exist right now. If you think of people who graduated 10 years ago, social media was not an option, right? And some of them are now really talented social media managers and strategists, and they work on social media analytics tools, and they couldn't have known that was in the future. So I think not worrying about knowing the long-term view. You guys will be just fine.
And Whitney, you probably, I think, work with a lot of people that are sort of thinking about making career transitions and, getting themselves and you helping them get through that process of doing that. And what are some of the questions that you might ask them or that they might be asking themselves during that process?
Yeah, so the number one thing that I do with my clients who are eager to make a transition is to first figure out what they're needing. We all have the same needs, but our prioritization of those needs vary. So we all need security. We understand what that's like. We all need growth. We understand what that's like. But sometimes we need more flexibility or variety or independence. Sometimes we need more learning or purpose or meaning. It varies. So that's really my first focus, is helping people identify what are they needing the most right now that isn't being met in their current role, maybe isn't being met in their current industry. And once we've identified what those things are, then I help them to take a look at the different domains of business where their skills can apply, and also the levels of impact within a company, because sometimes you're not getting, maybe you have security, but you're not getting growth because you're at a level in the company that isn't challenging you to the extent that you need. Or maybe you're in a place where you are managing people, but what you really want to be doing is making a contribution to the product. So we figure out from those core needs that are really calling them the most, what shifts do they need to make on various axes in order to get those needs met.
Yeah, it makes me this whole thing about, reassessing and asking yourself the same questions kind of on a continual rotating basis. Makes me think about, so when I was a kid, I, for whatever reason, even though I lived in a really safe town and we'd never had a house fire, I was always scared of our house burning down. So I used to keep a trash bag with all of my favorite things in it. I'd put them in every night and keep the trash bag right near my bed so that if we had a fire overnight, I could grab the trash bag and all of my favorite things would be in it. And I think about that because, my favorite things at the time were a pink boombox, a teddy bear, like all that kind of stuff. I don't have a trash bag with a pink boombox in it anymore next to my bed. And if I were to do the same thing, which I don't do this anymore, but if I were to do the same thing, what I would put in my trash bag would be totally different because what I value and what's important to me has changed so dramatically. So, I think of it in the same way in terms of values related to jobs and what you need in your life.
Yes. Thank you for that, because I can relate that to myself. In my work, there was a time when I was just getting started that growth and stability and recognition were incredibly important to me. I had come from a place where I wasn't sure of my value. I wasn't sure of the value of my contributions. So I wanted to be in a place where I could get recognition. That was really important to me. As my career has progressed, I've found a way to give myself the recognition that I need. And so I'm not as reliant on my manager, my colleagues, the organization that I'm working with to provide that to me. And what has instead become really important to me is my autonomy. So now I focus on opportunities where I'm going to have a lot of independence, a lot of freedom, and can make my own choices rather than people making choices for me.
Yeah. Great. All right. So that's the background of the self-awareness and understanding yourself. So let's talk a little bit now. You start looking out in the world. You start looking at potential companies that you could work for. You come into Google's offices and see how awesome it looks. And you think, oh, I could totally see myself working here. So, I'm wondering, just from the outside, Alex, if you've come across, what are some of the things that people might look for on a company's website or in a visit to their offices that give an indication of what their culture is like?
Yeah, I think it's important to think about what you want to learn about a company and and it ties back to your values, right? If you're looking for flexibility, you should be asking about that. If you're looking for opportunities for growth, you should be asking about that. But I think there's also, especially at this stage in your lives, a really important sort of realization that I didn't make until later, which is a lot of jobs are not what you think they are. A lot of companies are not what you think they are. Most of the jobs and the companies that look super sexy on the outside aren't. Some are. But if you think about, maybe I want to work for Vogue, right? Like, it's not the same as it in your head. It's not the same as in your movies. Some people love it and some people don't. But really getting to the truth is really important. Understanding the people who love it here, why do they love it? And the people who might not be a good fit here, why wouldn't they like it? Those are two of my favorite questions to ask people. When I was, before answering your question, when I was still a management consultant, I really enjoyed the work I was doing, but a lot of people were leaving as we sort of finished a 2-year rotation, which is sort of a normal process, and I was feeling sort of that fear of missing out. Is there like grass is greener somewhere? Should I stay? And so I did a bunch of informational interviews, and I talked to people. I wasn't looking for a job, but I wanted to know what their job was like. I reached out to alumni of my university. I reached out to people on LinkedIn, asked for 15 minutes of their time via phone, and gave them a really specific reason why I wanted to talk to them specifically, and got some really good, surprising answers back, people willing to talk to me. And I talked to someone who worked for the UN. I talked to someone who was a brand manager for Pepsi. I talked to all sorts of different roles that sounded cool. And I remember this moment where the brand manager at Pepsi, I was like, that sounds like a cool job, explained to me that to change a shade of red on a t-shirt, she had to get like 6 sign-offs or something ridiculous. And I was like, that's it. This is not a job for me. But from the outside, it seemed really cool. And so I think that's like the biggest thing to remember when you go in is there's things that are shiny and sound exciting, but no job is perfect. Every job has its good and bad days. And the question is, you want to pick the bad. Like you want to say, this is bad. The bad part I'm willing to put up with. And so for some people, some jobs have really tough hours sometimes. But for the growth and the impact and the excitement and the learning, compensation, whatever it might be, they might be happy putting in more hours. They're not happy, but willing to have that be their trade-off. For other people, that's not the right trade-off. And so I think when you go into a company, it's really digging into, what are the core values of the company? What kind of people get celebrated? How do projects get assigned? My favorite question to ask, actually, I got asked this by an applicant, was what has been your favorite day at the Muse? And they asked every single person they interviewed with, and we talked about it afterwards. We're like, what a cool question. But I think it gives you sort of insight into the sort of people when they're energized, what's the best part of it, and does that sound fun to you? So I think it's really important to sort of dig a little bit underneath the veneer and hear about the reality of it. And you can do that in interviews, you can do it informationally, you can do it when running into someone in the hallway at Google.
Yeah, and I think, there are so many companies that, as you said, do have that external, oh, that looks like fun, or, that looks really, really cool. And then you really dig into what the day-to-day job is like, and those two things don't match up that well. And I think one of the other things that I'd be really interested in getting both of your thoughts on is how to navigate the space of being the only or the potential first to join a company. So being the only woman on an engineering team if you're joining a startup, or maybe you're the only person of color joining an organization. And how do you handle that? And is that even something that you want to jump into? Because I know for a lot of people, they'll look at a tech company's website, and if you scroll down and it's all white guys, no offense, any white guys, but if that's all you see, then do you really want to raise your hand and be the first person there? And how should you navigate that?
Yeah, it's not easy. I think especially for people who want to be in technology, I think it's hard to have it be a blanket, like this is a deal breaker. You certainly can, but with the makeup of the industry right now, a lot of companies won't change if we're not the ones who change it. But I think it's really important to differentiate between startups that may be small, either didn't know better or haven't really figured it out yet, but genuinely are committed to inclusion and diversity, are genuinely welcoming places, and places that sort of would be perfectly happy continuing in the status quo. And so I think listening to yourself and the experience you have when interviewing. We had someone come and interview for us, actually. We had a male engineer come interview for us who was tag team interviewed by 2 engineers on our team. The more senior one is a woman of color. The more junior one was a white male, and the applicant exclusively spoke to the man. And we're fortunate because we are the employer to get to make a choice as to whether we want to bring people like that onto our team. But think about the opposite experience, right? And if you're coming in as the applicant, how you're being regarded, how they're talking to you. Unfortunately, for many of us who've been the only or been in situations like that, and you have a sense of whether it's really if there's negative intentions there. So I think there's listening to that and not putting it aside is important, but also giving companies a chance. when we went through Y Combinator in Silicon Valley, the accelerator program, there were 135 founders in our batch. 8 were women, of which 3 were us. Half of them didn't speak to us for like a month because they were scared. Kind of hilarious, but also really sad. And they just didn't have exposure. And we worked, and that wasn't the intention of YC. It was the population that was applying at the time, and we've really worked with them, and they've worked as well, and it's now up to 20%, right? And then they're continuing to sort of see improvements. And so I think that commitment is really important. And it's okay to ask them about it and say, hey, I noticed that you don't have any women on the team. Like, can you tell me a little bit about that? How uncomfortable are they? What are they doing? The last thing I would say is if you're looking just at the engineering team, look at the rest of the company. Are there women in leadership and management positions in other parts of the organization? Are there people of color in management and leadership positions in the rest of the organization? If it happens to be just a vertical problem, then that's different potentially. It could be, okay, they're trying, or maybe they haven't tried yet, but they should be, and they're not looking in the right places, versus the entire company seems to be pretty homogeneous.
And Whitney, I think you've had experience in a lot of male-dominated environments, so anything you want to add to that?
I have. I got used to it pretty early. I went to Carnegie Mellon for computer science, and the graduating class the year before I got there had more Daves than women. And so that quickly set me up for a different level of comfort being an only. I've had many experiences in my career where I'm the only person under 40 in an organization or on a project, or even maybe in an like a meeting where I'm representing my area of expertise, but everyone else in the room is considerably older. I have found that there are ways that I can use that to my advantage. My perspective has always been to take what I see as being a detriment and turn it into an asset, whether it's age, gender, color, whatever it is. And there have been times when what I was needing was in alignment with an ability to push those barriers and to try to bring about change. But then there are times when it's just not worth it. And if you are really interested in figuring out what a company's culture is like and its friendliness to women, I encourage my clients to ask during an interview, what is your maternity leave policy? It doesn't matter if you're not planning on having a kid or you're young, but I think it says a lot about how they think about women in the workplace.
Right.
And it's worth you knowing that before you commit, and maybe you're there 2 years and maybe you want to start a family, or maybe you're finding that they aren't hiring other women and there's a really good reason for that because the organization isn't set up to support women long term. I think there are other questions around how does decisions get made, or what happens when someone makes a mistake, that you can get a sense of the degree of compassion that is present in the culture. Is it a compassionate organization, or is it a very top-down, do what I tell you to do kind of directed organization? And that could give you a sense of whether there is room for growth or whether they're looking to change. So it's great to be a pioneer, but only in an environment where there is a willingness to change and a real kind of an ability for them to move towards a more equal environment.
Yeah, and I think that, it just makes me think about all of the issues around looking at, especially if you're working in a startup, founders, what their intentions are, and in a company in general, whether you walk in and feel like, these are my people, like I fit here, versus kind of going like, I don't know, this company has a fancy name, or they're doing really interesting work, but I don't feel like I would actually fit. And I know, just in my personal experience too, sometimes that idea of like, oh, well, the job looks good and the organization or the company is really interesting, but the person I'd be working for seems a little crazy. Like that's like run the other direction. Most of the time, your experience at work is often directly driven by whoever you're going to be working for. And I think that's an important question to ask as well in terms of where you're at in the interview process. Who is your manager going to be? The majority of people end up walking away from jobs because of a negative relationship with their manager, not liking their manager.
A great question to consider when you're meeting the person who is going to be your manager is to ask, do I want to sit next to this person on a plane for 6 hours? Because you may very well be traveling together. And if you can't stand the person, if you feel like it's going to be a painful experience to be in that kind of enclosed situation, they're not the person to be working with every day.
And not to assume that anything negative would happen, but I think one tool for women to have in their toolkit is to kind of know in advance, or at least think about in advance, how they might handle a situation that is very difficult in the workplace. So that might be something like being in an interview, for instance, where someone asks you a kind of inappropriate question that they're not legally allowed to ask you. But sometimes, especially in the startup world, they don't know what's legal and not legal. So they might ask you, are you planning to get married? Do you think you're going to have any kids anytime soon? How do you handle that type of thing? And then also when you're starting to work for a company, how do you handle it if you have a boss who is asking you out on a date or, doing something that you're really uncomfortable with? Those are very difficult situations to navigate, I think, especially if you're in a situation where you're an only or you're a first. So I'd love both of your thoughts about dealing with those types of situations.
Yeah, it's funny. We actually just published an article this week on responses to illegal questions in interviews. I think first thing is, especially when people are asking about anything personal, you're not required to answer an interview. I think it's important for you to know. You can say, either I'm not sure or I'm not sure this is relevant, but I'd love to hear more about the role. Like you can completely pivot. You're not required because they asked to answer the question.
You can do the politician thing, right?
Be a politician.
And answer the question you wanted them to ask, not the question that they actually asked.
Exactly. So are you planning on getting married and being like, I'm hope my relationship continues to go well, but let's talk about the role. You don't have to tell them the answer. I think the other thing in terms of facing any sort of uncomfortable situation, whether it's discrimination, sexual harassment, anything like that, which could happen in the workplace, at an industry event, but not someone you work for, anything. The first thing, which I think is can be really hard, is to know it's not your fault. You didn't do anything, and you have to internalize that before anything like this happens. When we first started fundraising for the Muse very early on, my co-founder and I, we're both women, faced a lot of discrimination and some borderline sexual harassment from certainly a mix of misogyny, sexism, benevolent sexism, all of the above from investors. And it wasn't until we spoke to so many other female founders at our stage that we're like, it's not us, we're not crazy, we didn't say anything that would make, nothing. I think that's a really important piece. I recommend documenting, at least write it down. Whether it could be an email to a friend, an email to yourself, just so that you have a record while it's fresh in your mind. If it's something that's small, that's like a harmless comment, but that you're like, it's kind of sexist, I'd rather, I'm fine, I could just brush it off. You can choose whether or not to speak up. You can have a one-on-one conversation. You can also, depending on the company, if you feel comfortable, you can go to your boss, you can go to HR. But I think the biggest piece also is to speak up for other people. And I say this also for the men in the room, right? If you hear someone make an offhanded joke, right? It could be sexist, it could be racist, it could have just a tinge of, it's a joke, right? We're not making, it's so much easier for the person who's not being targeted by it to say, hey, cut it out, that's not cool. It's so much easier to sort of be the person that creates an inclusive environment where not, you can talk to them separately, but I think it's important to sort of know that you can be a piece of that. And unfortunately, the reality is, a number of you will probably experience something like this at work or outside of work because the world sucks. You guys, some of you already know it, right? Maybe some of your teachers don't really think, or didn't in the past or currently don't think that you have the same ability or potential that you actually do. And so I think that question of self-worth is really important, knowing yourself, knowing what you're capable of, but also not being afraid to either fight it or walk away. You know, it's not always, you don't need to always fight it, but you can say, I'm not willing to put up with this. I know where my limits are, and I'm going to go look for another job.
I really want to echo what you said about it not being your fault. There are so many reasons why we believe we did this to us, but hopefully you're hearing it now. It doesn't matter what you're wearing. It doesn't matter how you did your hair, the makeup you put on, the jewelry, the lack of any of those things, what you said, how you said it, what your body language was. There is nothing that you have done to invite that behavior. That behavior
Certainly in the workplace.
Yeah, certainly in the workplace or anywhere. And that behavior is perpetuated when we allow it. So rather than internalizing it and saying, I must have done something, it is really important that you first give yourself self-empathy and self-compassion. Like, how is this making me feel? However it is that I feel about this is okay. It's all valid. What am I needing right now? I'm needing some awareness around this person's inappropriate comment or behavior. I'm needing space. That's allowed. Like, you know what? I'm taking the rest of the day off. I need space to just process what happened. Or I need some connection around this with somebody else. You really first need to take that opportunity to tune in with what is going to be best for you in the situation and acknowledge that the other person's behavior, whatever form it came in, is what is triggering you. It is not something that you have done.
Yeah. And I was just going to say, I think that's this also brings up the idea of having a strong network of people that you trust and that you can turn to. And so that if something does happen and you're not sure what to do, that you can turn to a mentor or a friend or a colleague or somebody just to bounce it off of and you know, get that sense. As you said, it wasn't until you started talking to other founders that you really understood that it wasn't you guys. It was the system. It was how things were happening to lots of other women.
And what's interesting is what we were talking about just now is sort of the most egregious, sort of challenging piece, but it can be really small things. So when we were pitching the company really early on to investors, one of the questions we got a lot was, so, you know, tell us, like, how do we know that you're in it for the long term? We were sort of asked this question about longevity, and we tried different answers, and there's different things that we would say, and we felt like we never really landed. And so we talked to other women we knew, and they told us this is how I answer the question. But it was while we were going through Y Combinator, we had all these male founders around us. We said, how do you guys answer this question? They were like, we don't get that question. No one asked us if we're, like, I don't know how we'd answer that question. That sounds like a really hard question. And what we realized is the question was some sort of subtext around, okay, but like in 5 years, if you get married and you have kids, like, how do I then know that you're in it for the long term? But the question itself seemed like a fairly innocuous one until we realized we weren't being asked it. And so we then actually learned in terms of how we pitch to sort of preempt a lot of those questions and say, we're really committed to this long term. Before they asked us that question, we think this is a big opportunity. We want to take the company public. We're going up against LinkedIn. And that's sort of how we learned it, but we could have never figured that out. And it's not that they did anything to make us feel a certain way, but it's that we might not have gotten the opportunity to get the investment from those people because of their own subconscious beliefs and questioning that they may not even realize were gendered.
Yeah, I've had that experience as well where I was on a team where the lead was male, and whenever he would interact with other members of the team, he'd refer to them by name. Oh, hey, Michael. Hey, Steve. Hey, sweetie, to me. Or hun, or something like that. And eventually, I saw the pattern, and I realized that this is how this is a word that he's using, or terms that he's using for women in the office in general. And so when he said it once, I just really lightly said, I prefer Whitney. And he was like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. And he really did not know that he was doing it. And bringing it to his awareness was definitely a shocking moment for him, but I think it was a really helpful one because these behaviors are so ingrained in our society. And I've seen women do it to women too. Women treat women as much as men treat women as women.
I met someone who reached out to me because she wanted to pitch me about potentially partnering with my company. We sort of vaguely had friends in common, but did not know her. Followed up a bunch, finally said yes to get coffee with her. And the first 5 minutes, she sees engagement ring on my wrist before my wedding, was like, oh my gosh, you're getting married, that's so exciting. So I was like, yes, sorry, we're getting married, like excited to hear more about your company. Ends up asking me if I want to have kids, like going into all these questions where I'm like, I thought you were pitching. I'm very confused as to the purpose of this meeting. And we ended up not working with them, not because of that specifically, but like I don't feel any particular desire to like go out of my way because it was just such a shocking moment. I was like, if we were getting coffee just to be friends, like maybe if I'd known you longer, you could ask me that question. But it's amazing the things people think is appropriate.
Yeah. Well, I want to open it up to questions in just a minute. So start thinking of questions, and we've got a couple of mics in the aisles
Do not
for
be
you guys.
shy.
Yeah, do not be shy. But before we do that, Alex has a new book coming out that she co-authored with her co-founder, Catherine, The New Rules of Work. And I think Andy mentioned, or I mentioned this morning, that we're doing a raffle through the LiveCube app. So we're going to raffle off some of these. They are not out yet. So
Come out April 18th.
April 18th. So I just wanted to ask you, what out of all of the new rules of work, what's like your favorite one or two kind of top new rules of work?
It's a good one. I think my favorite part, so the book is separated into 3 parts. The first is all about how do you figure out what you want to do. So it has all the different values, it has exercises you can do, all the different functions and industries you might think about going into and how to research them. The whole second part is around job search, so cover letters, resumes, interviewing, how to negotiate an offer, what you can, and all of that good stuff. And the third one is once you get the job, how to succeed. And so we go through communication, productivity, how to run a meeting. We sort of stop just shy of management. So there's a little bit about managing up. But I think my favorite part is the first one, the part about the values that we hadn't really articulated. So this is taking some of the best content from the Muse, but also adding a lot more to it and making it this A to Z guide you can go from end to end, fill out yourself. And we realized that the thing you can't do in a short article is talk through this process of figuring out what you want. So I think that's my favorite part, is sort of thinking about the values. It has questions you can ask people, your friends or your family, about your strengths to make you like reflect. And then it has a whole grid where you can actually go and do research about, okay, I think that's what I might want to do. Let's check if sales really has, like how it lines up against my 3 top values. Let's see if marketing or journalism or whatever might be interesting. So I think that's probably my favorite part.
Awesome. I can't wait to read it. All right. With that, questions. If you have a question, please stand up near a microphone so that we can hear you. So guys, stand up and you can line up by the microphone. Do you see the microphone in the aisle? Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so I guess I'm the closest one.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. So I guess the biggest question that grew in me through the talk is, so when you say ask the probable employer about like maternity leave, for me it's just so like it's one of like no questions for me, because like come on, like there are 30 men right applying for this software engineer, and like I am maybe like one of few women, and now here I am saying I'm not married and I kind of like curious about your maternity leave. Like I think it's like I feel it's a big disadvantage, and it's like a question I save for the later stages. And like, what do you think about it?
Yeah, I think it's fair, and I'll let Whitney. I know Whitney said it originally. I think there's different points in time to ask different kinds of questions. I think after you have an offer is a really great place to be like, can you share any of your policies? Tell me about your insurance. Like, how does vacation work? Any parental leave or family leave? Just so I know all of what you guys offer. It makes it a little bit broader. I'm also a big proponent of parental leave, not maternity leave, because men also take leave. Or they should. I think so. That's a really sort of useful time to dig in more on that. I think there's also questions you can ask around flexibility, but it depends again on what's important to you. And being able to look around and say, okay, if I'm trying to see if this company is really going to be welcoming towards women, what are the things I want them to be welcoming towards? Some people want a cutthroat environment. Some of you guys might like that. That's okay. That's not a masculine thing. Not only men like that, but knowing what sort of you value is important.
Cool. If I can I ask just one more question? So when you say formulate what you want from a job and then find the companies that could probably offer that, would you point us to some kind of resources that would do something like that? Because maybe I do have a list, right? Like I want to travel, I want the flexibility, I want like a good opportunity to not work from the office and things like that. But is there any platform I could use to make it more efficient, a search like based on the desires?
Depends on the desires. We cover some of this stuff. You can find some stuff on Glassdoor. Some things are just not sort of publicly listed as much, but if for example, I'd love to be able to work remotely, that can be one of the early things you look for, and it's often in the job descriptions. They, more and more, they have benefits and perks or information about the company, and looking up the company, going to their career page, the things they choose to highlight is what they're proud of. And so if, on our profile, we have a diversity and inclusion group, we let people work remotely, all that is on our company profile. That's something that we talk about, and so that's a place to start, and to also following them on social media can be really useful, Instagram and Twitter, things like that, because they often share stories from employees, and it gives you a bit of a sense of what it's actually like.
Yeah, and I think that listing of benefits is often both about what they're proud of, but also who are they hoping to attract, right? So if the list of benefits is we have a foosball table and an unlimited keg and all of this stuff, like hint, hint, they're probably trying to attract like young males. Not that women don't also like those things, but in their mind, they're thinking like that's who's going to come. And so I think, looking at other companies where they're highlighting their leave policies or well-being programs or paternity leave or being able to work remotely, it's in part because they're proud of those things, but those are also things that they're looking to hire for. So they're going to be looking for someone, if they're really proud of the fact that they're a dispersed company and they have a lot of remote workers, they're going to be looking to hire people who are capable of doing that and really do want to work remotely. They're not going to want to hire someone who needs the structure of a typical 9-to-5 work environment.
I'd like to add that I'm a big fan of asking the questions that won't get me hired. I think it's important to ask what's important to you. So if parental leave is important to you and knowing how they treat new parents in the company is important to you, you avoiding to ask a question out of fear of what their answer might be or how it could affect your prospects at getting hired, I do not believe is the right strategy. I like asking the tough questions. It puts people on the spot and you get an honest answer 9 times out of 10. And then you know clearly what you're walking into rather than shielding yourself from it and then finding yourself in an environment that is not conducive to doing your best work.
I think the biggest thing about that is it's if it's important to you, right?
Yes.
It's like knowing what your top things are, and then if company didn't give you a job because you asked about parental leave, then there's ways in which you've dodged a bullet, absolutely. But if that's not important to you, then spend the time on the important things.
And if it's also about what you said too about planning 2 to 5 years out. So if it's not on your radar in the next 2 to 5 years to potentially have kids, then, obviously it's up to you, but that may be something that's like farther down on the list, that question doesn't matter now, but 5 years from now it might matter. And so you'll ask that question then, but you don't need to ask it as like your first job out of college.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions? Go ahead, you guys can take turns.
Well, earlier you said that you were, I guess, interviewing a company or interviewing a potential company, and it felt very inappropriate when they saw your engagement ring and started talking about that section of your life.
Yeah.
What's interesting is when you're in that position, it's easy to say that I don't want that company. But when we're in the opposite position where we're saying, okay, I'm looking to get into a company, and you don't want to feel as if you're not entertaining the conversation. So you're in this awkward place where you're like, this person is getting too personal, but at the same time, I don't want to come off as being dismissive.
Yeah.
So that kind of balance is and I've experienced it before. That kind of balance is like, it's blurred because I want the opportunity, but I don't want you to ask me all those personal questions. So I just like your opinion on that.
Yeah, it's even in my situation, I answered her question about my wedding. Like, I didn't skip it, and I think there's an element of it which is that it's uncomfortable in human interaction not to reciprocate. Someone asks you a question, you feel like you're supposed to answer. It's sort of a normal dynamic. For me, when those things come up, it's how quickly can you answer it perfectly nicely, very respectfully, but not the extended version, let's say, and try to turn it in another direction. And so in this case, it could be like, yeah, absolutely, getting married next month. I'm very excited. So I was so interested when I got your email. Tell me more about your company, and turning it around. In an interview, it might be, if they're asking you a question about your personal life, it's turning around saying, is there a lot of, do a lot of people spend time outside of work? What's the culture like? I'm curious how people, finding sort of another direction to take it. But you don't want to offend people, and I understand that. I think the other thing that helps in those situations is knowing that you have options. And so I'm a big believer. So when you go and apply to college, you think about safety schools, target schools, and like your reach schools. And then people go and apply for jobs, they just apply to reach jobs. They're like, we're all going to work for Walt Disney, or like, we're all going to work for Google. It doesn't mean you shouldn't apply, but I think it's important to think about that same sort of structure and saying, okay, this is a job at a company that I'm pretty sure I can get. I feel pretty qualified for. If I had other options, I wouldn't go there, but I'd be okay with that. And having sort of those different options also means in those situations, if you're pushed too far, knowing that there's something else out there can sometimes make it easier to draw the line, and feel like you're not sort of stuck in a corner.
Yeah, and I think there are, things that can be deal breakers at certain points and aren't deal breakers at other points. And I think, one of the hardest positions to be in is if you really need a job for financial reasons, and you have one option on the table, and say that one option is asking you too many personal questions. That's really then like an internal decision of, okay, do I need to take this job right now, even though I'm a little bit uncomfortable with, how they might handle things, because I got to pay rent and I don't have another option, and I need to do this for the next 6 months at least, and I'm going to keep my eye out for something else. And I think, so, having some of those conversations with yourself and knowing kind of what you said, like what's a reach, what's accessible, how sort of quote unquote desperate. You don't ever want to be desperate for a job, but the reality is people are desperate for jobs. We have a lot of unemployed people who will take anything. They just need something so that they can pay the rent. Student loans, whatever it is. So there may be times where you do have to compromise a little bit on something that is of value to you for a short period of time. And often what I tell people is to like set a time limit, so you don't get sucked into compromising your values for the next 10 years, but you can say to yourself, okay, for right now, no, this is not the ideal situation, but it's what I need in this moment to get through the next year.
The other thing I'd say is have one or two answers, go-to answers. Like for really egregious comments, I like to laugh and be like, "How could you even? Are you allowed to ask me that?" Like really nicely, totally as if I don't know the answer to that question. And sometimes that just sort of like moves on. They're like, yeah, actually, no, let's skip that one. And you're like, so it's not always the right way to go. But like if you feel like you know one or two things, or if you commonly get asked the same question, like kind of rehearsing your like, how do I quickly move out of this? Means that you can sort of not spend 10 minutes and be like, we only had a 30-minute interview. We spent 10 on my personal life. I didn't get to tell you about my skills and why I love this company and what I can bring to the table. Like that's also what you're missing out on. It's not just that they're asking about your personal life. It's that you're getting less time to show how great you are as an applicant.
Great. All right. Question over here, and then do we have 2 questions over here? Okay. So those are our last questions that we can do, these 3.
Hi. Thank you for sharing your story and input and advice and everything. You guys mentioned a little bit about your earlier careers, and I want to know how you guys got started and what was your first internship and what made you stand out?
Yeah. So I mentioned that I had gone to Carnegie Mellon for computer science. I didn't graduate with computer science, though I ended up falling in love with writing, and I got my bachelor's in professional writing, and then I stayed at CMU for a master's in human-computer interaction. So what I ended up doing was the human side of technology, right, rather than the programming side of technology, and I became a user experience designer, which I did for about 12 years. And I've been working independently, meaning running my own business, since 2008. And in that time, I have consulted with a lot of businesses, gotten to understand what was going wrong and why they were seeking my help, and discovered that it was less about their lack of knowledge of how to use technology in the best way, and it was more about interpersonal issues that were going on inside the company that were getting in the way of making the right decisions. So over time, I shifted to coaching, and what I do now is advise leaders in organizations and aspiring leaders on how to have greater self-awareness, greater empathy for their customers, their colleagues, how to communicate more effectively, in essence, how to be the best possible leaders so that they're working together effectively and making the best possible decisions that will affect the success of the company.
So I grew up in France. My dad's Greek, my mom's Belgian. In France, you study science. If you're smart, it's what you do. It's the best choice. It's true in a lot of countries. And I was convinced I was going to do genetics. That's what I loved. My senior year, I had to specialize between math, physics, and biology. I did biology, I did genetics research at 17, and said, this is what I'm going to do. And then I came to the US for college. My father had done the same from Greece, fresh off the boat. And I came here and I had the opportunity to take lots of different classes. So I took genetics classes, did lab, I did chem lab, and all that good stuff, and realized I was intellectually fascinated by it, but I didn't actually love being in a lab, and that was what I was choosing. So I tried a bunch of different things. I ended up being a political science major. And to your question about the internship, my very first internship, my freshman year, I actually worked at a wildlife hospital on an island in Greece to practice my Greek, which I had learned my freshman year. So I'm going to skip that one. But my sophomore summer, I worked for I worked at the EU in Brussels. I spoke French, so that's sort of one of the ways I stood out. But I worked for a small organization called Southeast England House. So it was representing the southeast of England to the EU. There were like 10 of us, 2 interns out of the 10. And I stood out by I think through the application process, I had done some research about that region of England, about what their needs were. And so instead of just saying, I'm excited to come and represent Southeast England, I said, you guys have a lot of industrial things going on. There's a lot around agriculture. I'm excited to learn how the EU can help benefit. So I think the research really helped. And then once I got there, curiosity and I think being proactive is how I did really well. I got to do some cool stuff. But the first few weeks, they were like, here's some papers. And I was like, I'm done with the papers. What else can I do? Every 10 minutes, until they're like, why don't you go to that conference that we were all going to skip and write up something that we can send back to our representatives back home. And then over time I was writing the newsletter, and then I got to sit in on the parliament. And at 19, that was super cool. But I did it because I kept showing up and being hungry instead of being like, cool, it's 4 p.m. Let's just I'm done with work, I should leave. But taking the opportunity to sort of keep bringing more to the table. And then my next internship, I worked for the State Department in Paris. I was at the U.S. Embassy in Paris. The fact that I spoke French certainly helped. The work I'd done the previous summer helped as well. I sort of tied it all in. And then I realized I didn't want to go into diplomacy. So, but in all of those things, I learned something about myself. And I learned that I love being really efficient and that the impact was important, and that State Department has that. You can have massive impact. It just takes a really long time. I was like, I want faster impact. And then that's how I did the pivot to figure out what's the next thing after college.
Awesome. All right, last couple of questions. Go ahead.
Hi. So I want to get back to the topic with diversity, but not really as much as gender or I don't know, origin, from Colombia. But then about diversity in terms of intellectual beliefs, what do you believe in, and like today, right now, with political. So with that, how would we deal with that? Being a woman, then having believe that is if I'm in a company where it's not biased, but like it has a lot aside. So for me, being a woman and a Latina woman, it's being really difficult to go through that and also have a different belief. So how would I deal with that?
Yeah, it's a really hard climate. Yes. Yes, she's saying you're not alone. Definitely not alone. That's a really hard climate to be in. And you know, I think that a lot of it really has to do with you can have an amazing, outstanding culture and very different beliefs. And a lot of it is the level of respect that people have for each other, how they treat each other if they're coming from different places. And then again, I think that some of it is where your personal line is. You know, everybody's got a line in the sand around if someone has this belief, then like I can't work with them, you know, and that's okay. That's your own personal choice about where that stands. And so I think it is possible and actually very helpful to have an intellectually very diverse company that has a positive culture in which people respect and support each other. So at least to me, it's a matter of trying to find that versus trying to find something where everyone only thinks one way. But you guys might have some additional
We've had,
thoughts.
I mean, it's been tough. We have 50% of the office was crying the day of the inauguration, like in the office, like bawling, including myself, like snot out the nose, like not a good look. And it was, but there's also people in our office that I'm sure did not vote the way that I did. The way we've handled it is, so we believe in what we call being whole humans, that what happens outside the office impacts you inside the office and vice versa. So if you have a tough day at work, you bring it home. You have a tough day in life, like that comes with you as well. And we actually started the conversations before the election around Black Lives Matter, and the week that Philando Castile and Alton Sterling died was when we first started having some of those conversations in the office around how there are some people in the office this week that have been a lot more affected by the news than others. And it's really important for us to recognize that both in people that report to you and your peers. And so I'm from France. When the attack happened on Bataclan, like I had a really rough day. And other people had a tough day, but it's different because I had friends that were still missing, right? And so there's just a really different reactions that we all have. And so I think we'd started that conversation around respect and empathy. The other thing I'd say, and it's a controversial topic, is deciding whether or not and how much you want to talk about politics in the office. One of my direct reports, she's fantastic, came from a really large company, and she said, you know, we had a really, really tight team, and at some point, we ended up deciding to talk about politics, and there are some people who never looked at each other the same again. And we otherwise shared a lot of values and had a lot of things in common, and I wish we could have undone that conversation. Now, if the conversation happens, you can't undo it, but I think we're living in a world where a lot of people want to feel like they're active and being activists all the time, and if that's important to you, then finding a company where you can be an activist is important. There are companies that are like that, or you can work actually for activist organizations. But if not, the way that I've channeled it is as much as possible, I do all this in my personal life. My team knows where I stand. Most people know where people stand, but I don't go out of my way unless there's some really important topics. So we talked around the immigration ban, we talked about refugees, and we sort of try to create open spaces. But what I realized, and I think was really important, especially in New York and in technology, most people are actually quite liberal, and there's the way in which you might feel really uncomfortable in some conversations. There's probably a number of people at my company that felt really uncomfortable the day of the inauguration because they were actually okay with the outcome and they didn't feel welcome. And so if I really believe in inclusion and I really believe in respect and empathy, then making sure that those people know I still welcome them and I don't expect them to agree with me, even though I virulently disagree with them. It's a really hard line to draw. And as a leader, I can say certain things, but figuring out how important it is to you to be like an activist at work versus working with people I think are good people that are respectful and deciding whether or not to get into that realm.
Just real quick, because we have to get to our last question.
I also just want to add that not all of our needs are going to be met by our employer. So there might be times when you're feeling like, I'm getting the security, I'm getting the growth, I'm getting the purpose here, I'm not feeling community, I'm not feeling connection here. There are other places to get those needs met. It's important to keep that in mind, that your job is not the silver bullet to solve everything in your life. Yes.
It's like when you get married, you don't get everything out of your husband or wife.
All right, last question.
Hello. First of all, I just want to say thank you for this panel discussion. And I've also been following the Muse for quite some time. And and I just want to say that a lot of the situations and examples that you guys provided, I've personally experienced. And you know, working in technology, oftentimes I'm the only woman in the group. And over the years, I've learned that HR is not really your friend. They're there to protect the company, and they often see if you do report anything that it falls under the category of sexism. That they often see you as a problem and try to figure out a way to like get you out. So it's just such a difficult situation to be in. You know, like, how do I not take things personally? How do I not act in a way where things will get retaliated against me? And one of the things that you guys mentioned was, well, if you realize that maybe this isn't the company that's giving you what you need, maybe you should leave. But it's difficult to leave and to start a job search and hope for another job. I mean, sometimes the job search process takes months. And I've been working in the field for a long time, and things haven't changed. But I just want to say this. I want to actually ask you, late last year, I don't know if anyone's a group of like Pantsuit Nation So I sort of like vented a little bit about, you know, that experience of being an only woman and dealing with conversations that aren't really appropriate. And someone recommended a book called The Feminist Fight Club. Yeah. And because I always felt alone, like I'm dealing with these situations and having to figure out how to work through them alone. I picked up that book and I was just blown away at the like advice that they provide, to the point where I thought, oh my God, they need to create an app so in real-time situations in the middle of a meeting, you experience this sort of behavior, what should your reaction be to that? But I just wanted to find out, I mean, when is this gonna end? And also, what are your opinions about that book, or do you have any other suggestions, like reference material?
Yeah, Feminist Fight Club is awesome.
It's amazing.
Just in terms of like, it's a real reference guide of like, holy crap, I don't know how to deal with this situation. What should I do, kind of thing. So yes, I would absolutely recommend that. You know, this question of when is this going to end? You know, I know that at least in my experience, it often feels like no progress is being made. Sometimes it feels like we're going backwards.
Yes.
But I also know that at least from a day-to-day basis, getting groups of people together like this, you know, even looking at how the number of computer science majors has changed, that I think, you know, Stanford just finally has 50% of their CS students are now women, which is up substantially from the past. So there is hope, I think. There are more people, and including more men that I see, advising founders, male founders, that the first thing that they should do when they're trying to expand their team is hire a woman, so that as soon as the company starts growing, it's diverse, that you should be hiring people who don't look like you, who don't necessarily think the way that you do. I think there are more people approaching it from that situation, or from that standpoint. But I think the situation is also a societal situation. So I think a lot of, you know, what is happening in tech is also exists in finance, and also exists in real estate, and exists in society as a whole. So you know, it's a bigger issue than just changing the dynamics of a tech company. But I know we're really low on time, so if you guys have any,
Yeah, no, I think of gender equality the way I think about civil rights, which is we've made progress, but we're definitely not there yet. And it's all in day-to-day actions and words, but especially actions. More and more companies have parental leave. More and more companies care about these topics. And to your point about HR, like some departments are doing exactly that. Some care. consider when you're interviewing, spending time and talking to the HR rep a little bit more about their policies. I think if that's something that's important, that can be a place to see how they react, especially if there's a head of talent or someone really senior versus just sort of more junior HR places. That tends to show that they care more.
I think it's also really important that we take a look at our own behavior and see the ways that we are perpetuating sexism, racism, and other issues in the workplace, because sometimes it's so ingrained in us that we don't even know that we're part of the problem. And so it could be happening to us and we could be doing it at the same time. So I really think the only way we're ever going to see progress is if we continue to take a look at our own behaviors and ensure that we're acting in alignment with our own values.
Awesome. All right. I'd like to thank Whitney and Alex. Thank you guys so
Thank you
much.
guys.
Thank you all so much.
All right.